Hi everybody, this is Matt with Bludgeon Brawl. Today we continue our Planeswalkers As Commanders, an EDH Commander What If series. Once again, the goal of this series is to examine the types of decks that can be made if all Planeswalkers were able to be commanders. Today, I'll be focusing on Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord. As always, here's a big disclaimer. At the time of this video, Planeswalkers are not able to be legal commanders. There's a small exception, 11 Planeswalker cards printed in supplemental sets that specifically say they can be used as your commander, but otherwise, no Planeswalkers are able to be legal commanders. This series is intended to be a what-if example of what these kind of decks could look like, and as the Commander Rules Committee suggests, you're more than welcome to take a house rule in your playgroup that allows Planeswalkers to be commanders. So, if this list interests you, discuss with your playgroup and get building. Let's start with the commander. So Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord is the latest iteration of everyone's favorite vampire planeswalker. But what drew me to Sorin had nothing to do with him being a vampire though. Instead, his static abilities what intrigued me. As long as it's your turn, creatures and planeswalkers you control have lifelink. Giving creatures lifelink isn't anything new, but giving a planeswalker lifelink? That's unique. His other abilities aren't bad either, but first, Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord costs 2, a white and a black, and enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty. Here are the rest of his abilities. His +2 deals 1 damage to target creature or player. This works well with his static ability, allowing you to ping small creatures to death while also gaining a small amount of life. This ability might not be useful super often, but the occasional damage to a creature or to an opponent's face can add up over time. His last ability is a -X to return target creature card with converted mana cost X from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature is a vampire in addition to its other types. This allows you to get some great recursion going with some of your creatures, though it's pretty likely that those creatures are going to be cheaper in mana cost. So what does the deck really want to do? Sorin's abilities tend to lend themselves well to a couple strategies. The lifelink suggests using creatures, either really big ones or multiple smaller creatures. His -X suggests a recursion theme, though not the level of entombing a It That Betrays or anything like that. And he's a vampire, so of course you could run a flavorful vampire tribal. I chose to build this deck with a white weenie strategy, focusing on generating a bunch of tokens, swinging in, gaining life, and then potentially finishing someone off with Aetherflux Reservoir. In addition, there are a few Aristocrats elements to the deck. That said, I could see someone making an Aristocrats toolbox deck similar to an Aetherios build, generating small, incremental value over time by recurring certain effects, albeit small ones with Sorin. Finally, making a vampire tribal build is also an option. However, I think Edgar Markov is one of the more definitive vampire commanders, and Sorin himself doesn't necessarily synergize too well with vampires anyway. So if you're going that route, you might want to look at Edgar, especially since you get the color red in there, or any of the other Ixalan black-white vampires. They can all make fun little vampire flavor tribes as well. So let's start with the Planeswalkers in the deck. Sorin's static ability gives Planeswalkers and creatures lifelink, so of course, my first thought was how many Planeswalkers I could fit in that work with that. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of Planeswalkers in black and white that deal direct damage, and those that do, like Obnixilis the Hate-Twisted, aren't particularly good. So then I thought, what about making sort of an Oops All Gideon build? After all, he ends up becoming a creature a vast majority of the time. Unfortunately, I don't think Oops All Gideons works well with our token strategy, and we would often end up paying 4 to 6 mana for a 4/4, a 5/5, or a 6/6 with lifelink because of Sorin and typically indestructible, which isn't really a great curve for our deck. Ultimately, I decided to go more of an Oops All Sorins take for the Planeswalkers. Many of Sorin's past iterations create creature tokens or buff your creatures alongside some other beneficial effects. And of course, the infamous Sorin Markov can make someone's life total 10. That said, keep in mind that's life loss, so it doesn't actually get affected by the lifelink, but still a good card to keep in this deck. I also included Kaya, Orzhov Usurper, as a means of graveyard hate, plus her -5 actually deals direct damage, so it might actually gain you some life. Elspeth Sun's Champion and Elspeth Tyrell also make some great soldier tokens as well. Speaking of tokens, we need some token generators. We need creatures in general, and a whole lot of them. So we already have 5 Planeswalkers that can make tokens, but what about everything else? Creature-wise, we have Brimaz, King of Oreskos, Alenda the Dusk Rose, Endrick Sar, Master Breeder, Ghoulcaller Gisa, God Eternal Oketra, Hanweir Militia Captain that makes tokens when it flips, Josu Ves, Lich Knight, which you can kick to make some tokens, Knight Captain of Eos, which makes tokens and gives you a fog effect, which, still might be helpful, Liliana Heretical Healer, Skurdzdag High Priest, Oketra's Monument, Call to the Feast, Legion's Landing, Ethereal Absolution, Rite of Belzenlock, and Westvale Abbey. all of these different creatures, enchantments, lands make tokens in different ways, so be sure to adjust your plan according to whichever you're able to get onto the battlefield soonest. And in particular, I want to point out God Eternal Oketra. She is super powerful if you're able to take advantage of her token making, so be sure to give her protection when you can. Of course, if we're making a lot of creatures, we're also probably going to want to find ways to get value out of them other than just swinging in with a huge army. So that's where our sack outlets come in. And we have cards like Ailey, Eternal Pilgrim, Gulcaller Gisa, God Eternal Bantu, Sidisi Undead Vizier, Whisper Blood Liturgist, Yahenni Undying Partisan, Ashdown's Altar, Skull Clamp, and High Market. All of these will do different things when you sack your creatures. In particular, God Eternal Bantu, another God Eternal that is really powerful, will get you a lot of nice cards. Obviously, Sidisi will let you tutor, Whisper lets you recur, and things like that. All great cards to have and keep in mind. Of course, Ashdown's Altar will get you a bunch of mana. And speaking of mana, we're gonna need some ramp. We're in black and white, so we're limited to mostly artifacts or things that our creatures or other spells can kind of give us. So we have things like Commander Sphere, Darksteel Ingot, Belwar Stone, Gilded Lotus, Mind Stone, Orzhov Signet, and Sol Ring. In addition, as I mentioned, Ashnod's Altar will give us mana for our creatures, and Oketra's Monument will make our white creature spells a bit cheaper. Solemn Simulacrum will also let us find a land when it enters the battlefield, and Cryptghast will double our Swamp's mana output, which can become all of our mana with Urborg Tomb of the Yawgmoth. Finally, Smothering Tithe is a must in white decks because it is just bonkers how good this card is, so definitely be sure to pick up a copy. That's gonna get you a lot of really nice mana. We're also going to want to be able to recur some of our creatures. So Sorin has an element of recursion, but we'll also want to make sure we can hit higher CMC stuff if the time comes for other permanents. Sun Titan lets us return any permanent with 3 CMC or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. At minimum, that can be things like lands or some of your mana rocks, things like that, as well as some creatures. Whisper Blood Liturgist will get us back some creatures in exchange for some other creatures, and Yawgmoth's Vile Offering allows us to get creatures and planeswalkers back while destroying others. In addition, Ravos Soul Tender will get us creatures back, but only to our hand, which is still pretty good. We're also going to want to make sure that we have a nice removal package. My goal with removal in general in deck building is to be able to answer as many permanent types as possible, so that way I am as flexible as possible. So in that case, we have cards like Anguished Unmaking, Utter End, and Ailey that will hit any permanent. Path to Exile and Swords will hit creatures. Return to Dust hits artifacts or enchantments. We have Kaya's Wrath, Toxic Deluge, Elspeth's Sun's Champion, and Merciless Eviction, wiping the board of creatures. And in Eviction's case, you can wipe basically any other permanent type from the board as well. And of course, we have Yawgmoth's Vile Offering, as I mentioned earlier, allowing you to remove a creature or a planeswalker. If your meta has a lot of planeswalkers in it, or you find that you really enjoy getting a bunch of Sorins out and then sacrificing them to make your other Sorin ultimate or something like that, you may want to consider the Elder spell for mass planeswalker removal. I think it's going to be very strong in general for just 2 mana, especially if you're running the number of planeswalkers that we are running in this deck. So definitely keep it in mind if that is relevant or of interest to you. Sometimes you just need to find the right card, so we have some nice tutors and card draw. So we have Sidisi Undead Vizier as our tutor. In addition, we have a bunch of ways to get card advantage, such as God Eternal Bantu and Skull Clamp, which gives us cards in exchange for creatures. Twilight Prophet also gives us some card advantage and incidental life gain if we have the City's Blessing, which is pretty likely to happen. Timna the Weaver will also help us draw some cards too if we're spreading out our attacks. Again, something that we can probably do pretty well as long as we have enough tokens. Finally, Read the Bones and Sign in Blood just give us some direct card draw. So we're amassing this army, we're drawing them up, we're tutoring for them. We also need ways to buff our army. So one way that we can do that is by using Ravos Soul Tender and Ethereal Absolution. They both give some nice +1/+1 buffs. And then True Conviction will also allow us to get Double Strike and Lifelink onto our creatures. If we already have Sorin out, the Lifelink is redundant, but Double Strike is still pretty good. And then Sorin Lord of Innistrad and Sorin Solemn Visitor also have ways to buff our creatures too. And then of course we have Elspeth Sun's Champion's Ultimate, which will give our creatures +2/+2 and flying. The one thing I will say is if you're looking at this deck and you're kind of interested in it, you may want to add more buffs to this. I kind of focused on making the tokens, getting the value, but if you're somebody who really just loves swinging in as often as possible, you may want to add a couple different buff cards in here as well, some of which you'll be seeing on screen. So just something to keep in mind. And now I'm going to explain a couple of the miscellaneous choices that I have in here. So Blood Artist makes the cut because it drains our opponent when creatures die. Selfless Spirit helps protect our army from board wipes, whether they're ours or our opponent's, and it has a pretty cheap converted mana cost, which means there's going to be a lot of ways for us to get it back from our hand, either with Sorin directly or with Ravos, and etc, etc. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is a fantastic way to drain your opponent and gain some life. Teferi's Protection protects us from anything, so it's definitely in. Of course, this card is quite costly, so feel free to cut it if you don't have a copy or don't want to spend the money for it. I don't blame you. Anointed Procession will double our tokens, which is fantastic. Blind Obedience annoys and slows down our opponents, which is also great. Finally, Aetherflux Reservoir can be one of our win conditions if we gain enough life. Speaking of winning the game, the deck has basically two main strategies. The first is to swing in for a bunch of damage with our army, and the second is to gain enough life incrementally to Aetherflux Reservoir a couple of our opponents. This deck isn't built with the main goal of gaining a ton of life. It's more likely going to happen slowly over time throughout the game. So a card like Aetherflux Reservoir is going to be really good at pinging down one opponent in particular, assuming you've killed all your other opponents, or you've gotten them down pretty low and you just want to finish one problematic player off. While I don't run them in this build, you might want to consider Debt to the Deathless and Exsanguinate as well. These can often close out games by themselves, and with Aetherflux Reservoir can ensure that you are the victor. Plus, building massive mana can be easy with Ashnod's Altar out, and even if you only cast each for about 5 to 10 mana, that's still some massive life gain you're going to be doing, which again, when you have 3 opponents and you're playing Aetherflux Reservoir, can actually add up pretty well. I'm actually considering changing this build a little to make sure that I include them, but just something I want to keep on your radar if you are looking at the deck list in the description below. Next is our mana base. Just like I said in the Sarkin video, a lot of the mana base comes down to what dual lands you can afford. Original duels, shocks, scry lands, fetches, etc. Do what's in your budget and you'll be okay. That said, there's some utility lands I definitely want to mention. The first is Urborg, Tomb of the Yawgmoth. It makes all of your lands swamps, so this is great with another land, Cabal Coffers, to generate a ton of mana, and it's great with Crypt Gas, which I mentioned before. Vault of the Archangel gives Death Touch and Lifelink to our team, which is helpful and redundant in a good way. If you have a lot of 1/1s and you have gotten your buff spells, but you're able to give them Death Touch, people are going to be way less interested in attacking you. Windbrisk Heights will give us free spell casts when we attack with 3 or more creatures, which is very doable in this deck. Nithghost Shrine to Nyx can give us a lot of mana based on what our devotion is. And finally, Westvale Abbey, which I've mentioned before. It has okay token generation, a really good mana sink if for some reason you're just not drawing any cards, and it also has a nice fun flip, which makes it a very good, solid include in this deck. That's all I have for you today for Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord. If you liked this video, please give it a like and think about hitting that subscribe button. And if you like this deck, please click the link in the description to check it out. And of course, leave your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. Be on the lookout in the next 2 weeks for another Planeswalkers as Commanders video. I'm thinking of creating an Oops All Gideons deck, but I might change my mind, might make a Nissa deck. We'll see what happens with that. Finally, I'll leave you with some flavor text from a War of the Spark card that I find particularly moving, and it is from Rising Populace. The text reads, "Grief is a crucible where resolve is tempered." Man, War of the Spark has a lot of great flavor text. Very excited. If you're going out this weekend, enjoy your pre-release and have a really fantastic time. Thanks for watching, everybody, and see you next time.